Hey YouTube, I want to start painting this engine and start reassembling it, but first we've got to get some things cleaned internally and then tape off critical areas that we don't want paint on. So we're going to attack that now. Welcome to Urban Monk TV. Okay, so I've got all of my rags pulled out of here. The bottom end of the engine is open now with that oil pan taken off, and we've inspected everything in here that we can see, and we really can see a lot with that oil pan off, with the cylinders off, and these sides off. Internally, you can view all your critical components, and as I mentioned in another video, I can also take some critical measurements from here, like the distance between the connecting rod and the crank journals, which I am within spec, so we're good there. So it's just time to start cleaning up any residual down here. I'm going to use some parts cleaner and spray it down, but I want to try to avoid directly spraying right into the connecting rod and the crank journals, because there's some residual oil in between that bearing and that journal, and this will penetrate in there and bring that, draw that oil out of there and flush it out. And when I do an initial startup, I want something keeping things lubricated before the oil pump can bring oil to all of this stuff. So I'm going to be using some engine assembly lube on the top end to provide that lubrication, but I'm not going to take these off, so I don't have a way to get in there. So if I can just leave some of that lubrication there, that'll work to my advantage. There's not a lot there. I'm also, when I do light this thing up, so to speak, before I do that, I will disconnect the ignition, pull all the spark plugs or something, and then just crank it over with the starter to run that oil pump and get some oil circulating first at a slow RPM before I really rev it up. So anyways, time to start cleaning this out. And I can see some debris down here. And I just moved it out of there. This can is getting a little empty. The piece down here, I can see that my jet of parts cleaner is not getting. Yeah, it's not much. Just moved it around with my pick and it flushed. So I think we're good there. That's a dead soldier there. this area where the oil filter goes gathered some debris over the course of cleaning things out, so I'm just going to get that out of there. Okay, so I'm going to start taping off areas that I don't want to get paint on the sides, on the top of the crankshaft, oil filter housing, points, all the parts I don't want to get paint on. And I've got a couple different types of painter's tape that I'm going to use. I've got frog tape, which is a more expensive painter's tape. This stuff is really about having absolutely clean edges, and that I'm going to save for the detail work like on the gas tank. Then I've got a roll of this cheap orange stuff that's at the Home Depot's bargain brand, and that's what I'm going to use to tape off stuff that I just don't want to get paint on it. So save the good stuff for gas tanks and cosmetics, and use the cheap stuff for things like this. An X-Acto knife is handy for this. It's not the speed, it's the journey. Kind of a neat little trick of taping around these my mind has just gone blank here. The head bolts here. Just use my X-Acto knife to make a little X. And I can go down around it pretty flat. And then I'll just trim. All taped off. Now we're going to trim. Oh, I see I've got a little hole there I gotta cover up. I'll get back to that. Couple of noteworthy spots. I'm going to go ahead and let paint go into the inside of the starter compartment, but I don't want, this is where the starter plugs in. You don't want paint in that surface because that's a O-ring seal against oil. Those two holes go down into the crank, so we don't want paint in there. Plastic cap on that. The engine number, I blocked that off because God forbid a police officer can't read your number later on, so gotta have that available to them. This area here doesn't matter so much as you've got an entire cover that comes over the front sprocket here, and but you do have an area where I wouldn't want to get too much overspray. This is the gear position indicator bolts on right here, and I'm not going to be using that. Well, I talked about trying to pull that out of the old instrument panel and integrating it in somehow. So one way or the other, though, I've got to put that old sensor back there just because it'll develop oil there otherwise. So I covered that up and just keeping paint off of this shaft in here, but the rest of this doesn't really matter. This is all covered up. One additional comment on taping off here. Where the tape is sticking, there's been so much oil leaking around here that what I'm doing is spraying a rag with a little bit of carb cleaner and then just wiping this surface before I start taping so I get a good adhesion on the tape. Same kind of thing I did with the cylinder head bolts, putting a little X cut into tape and then running it down around the bolt, and then you can trim with the X-Acto knife real exactingly. That's getting to be much. Right around the edge. So a quick recap of the areas that need to be taped. The oil pan, the oil filter compartment. Oh, I got a little spot I got to touch up there. Points, ignition, clutch, where the cylinder head goes on over the crank, VIN, engine number. This is the sending unit for oil pressure. This guy, starter, where the starter shaft goes in, those two holes where the starter mount bolts go, and then over on this side, of course, around the rotor for the stator, the magnet rotor, and oh, I got some adhesion issues here already with oil. See, there's oil there. So, and then just around these shafts, but the rest of that doesn't matter so much. Now I'm going to get ready to prime, but most of this is cleaned up with a nice solvent, that parts cleaner, and ready to paint, but we've got areas where oil has collected again, so I need to just be, with a Q-tip in some areas, go around with the solvents again and a rag and really dry up all the oil, because if I'm spraying primer and paint over oil, that's not going to stick. So I've brought the engine outside. I've got it on some cardboard here to protect my concrete, and I've turned it upside down because I'm going to start at the bottom. I've got to get my solvent out and clean some of these surfaces real quick with a rag, but we're very good and dry here. I didn't want to put pressure on the head bolts, so I've got a piece of wood
they're propping it up, so it's really supporting all the weight this way on there, and then down on this side we're just on the crank. I don't care about this cheap Harbor Freight cart. If I get paint all over that, not a big deal. You can see what I've got to get cleaned up here. Shiny oil still, and I'm going to start spraying some primer on here. So I'm using VHT primer and also VHT paint. Start with the primer. What we want to do is multiple thin coats. If you've done any appreciable amount of painting, really resist the urge to try to get it all on in one or two coats. When you put on that first thin coat and even that second thin coat, you'll see areas that are not getting paint. Trust me, on the third thin coat, you'll get those areas. The paint will get there. But if you lay it on thick, you're going to get runs. It's much better to take your time. See some areas where I've got oil collecting, so I'm going to go and wipe that fast while I'm still. 30 minutes between coats, and I'm sorry, 10 minutes between each coat, 30 minutes before wet sanding. Okay, that's 3 coats of primer, 2 thin, a third medium, 10 minutes between each coat, and I've just done the bottom at this point. Well, I think that's going to be a wrap for this video. We've got that engine all painted and it's looking good. I'm very happy with the result. Of course, the proof is going to be in the pudding in the long term with this VHT paint. I imagine that the first time I fire this engine up and really heat it up, that I'm going to be putting that paint through some sort of curing process aside from drying. I'm hoping that the long dry time that I'm going to have on that surface between now and months from now, when I actually fire that engine up, really bakes that thing on, I guess bake's the wrong word, but cures. And then when I do run it, I hope that paint stays on there nice. I've got high hopes for it. Read a lot of reviews about this VHT, the high temperature stuff. They have like a 500 degree, and Rust-Oleum has a 500 degree. I think that's mainly meant to go on automotive liquid cooled engine blocks. So when you've got liquid cooling, you're probably not running as high a temperature as you are with an air cooled engine like this. So I went with the higher temperature stuff. This is up to, oh God, 1300 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a really big range. There's a 700-degree swing between those two. It's kind of weird, but whatever. And hopefully we got a beautiful engine for years and years to come. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to subscribe and like this video if you like it. And thanks for watching. Take care.